There is a category of man that intelligence services fear more than generals, more than bomb makers, more than financiers. It is the man who keeps the system running. The man no one photographs. The man with no press record, no public profile, and no single decision that can be traced back to him. The man who, if removed, does not stop the machine, but does leave a gap that takes years to fill. Hassan Muradpour was that man. By April of 2014, Muradpour had spent nearly 2 decades inside the IRGC's Quds Force External Logistics Directorate, moving weapons, money, and personnel across borders that officially could not be crossed. He was a brigadier general in function and in rank. He was, in practice, invisible. He traveled on commercial passports under names that changed every 18 months. He met no one in the same city twice. He communicated through a chain of intermediaries so carefully structured that pulling one thread rarely revealed the next. Mossad had been trying to locate him for 11 months. 11 months of surveillance, asset cultivation, and partial intelligence that never quite assembled into something actionable. In that time, they had not obtained a confirmed photograph. They had not confirmed his travel documents. They had not confirmed whether the man they were looking for was even the man who matched the name. 11 months. Almost nothing. Then a single piece of intelligence arrived from Istanbul. A name, a date, a train, and a unit that had 3 weeks to build an operation no one had attempted before, a long-range precision shot through the window of a passenger train moving at 160 kilometers per hour. Something for you before we go further, since you clearly cannot get enough of stories like these. Our limited edition ebook covers the operational history behind how Mossad developed and used targeting pipelines like this one, the intelligence chain construction, the asset management under time pressure, and the institutional decisions that determined when an operation proceeded. Scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description. Then stay with us. This story is just getting started. This is not a story about a perfect plan executed under pressure. It is a story about an operation that was wrong in at least 2 critical ways before it even began, and about the man sent to carry it out anyway. Most people inside Iranian weapons logistics never appear in Western intelligence files at all. They are screened out at the recruitment stage, chosen specifically for the absence of any Western profile, any travel history, any financial footprint that would give a foreign intelligence service a handle. Muradpour was not merely screened. He was engineered. Over nearly 2 decades, he had constructed a professional identity within the Quds Force that was deliberately kept out of formal command structures. His name did not appear on IRGC organizational charts that were later obtained by Western agencies. His rank was known internally, but never publicly confirmed. When Iranian state media covered the deaths of IRGC personnel in Syria or Lebanon, his was not a name that appeared, even when operations he had coordinated were directly involved. He was not famous for surviving. He was famous for never being found. His function, pieced together by Mossad analysts over the course of the 11-month surveillance period, was the movement of precision-guided munitions from Iranian production and storage facilities into Syria and Lebanon. Not the design of those weapons, not their deployment, the logistics that made both possible. The supply chain that replenished Hezbollah's arsenal after each Israeli air campaign, quietly and consistently, at a pace and scale that Israeli military planners had consistently underestimated. He was not the man who caused the problem. He was the infrastructure the problem ran on. By the spring of 2014, that distinction had started to matter at the highest levels of Israeli strategic planning. The number of precision-guided munitions identified in Hezbollah's possession had reached a threshold that Israeli analysts assessed as a meaningful shift in the balance of threat. And behind every assessment of how that stockpile had grown and continued to grow, one operational pattern kept appearing: a logistics coordinator embedded in the Turkish transit corridor, moving material through intermediaries who were technically operating in legitimate commercial sectors. One analyst had been tracking that pattern for 9 months. She had built a partial profile of the logistics chain structure from financial surveillance data, intercepted communications fragments, and reports from assets inside Turkish commercial cargo networks. She had a function. She had a general rank tier. She had a geographic signature, Istanbul, 4 times per year, spring and autumn rotations, always undercover, always brief. She did not have a name, she did not have a face, she did not have a single travel document she could tie to the target with confidence. That was the wall Mossad had been running into for 11 months. They were tracking the shape of a man without being able to confirm who occupied that shape. And then the intelligence changed. In late March, a Mossad Katsa operating out of Istanbul under commercial cover received a report from an asset designated Cyprus. Cyprus was a Turkish logistics broker. He was not an ideological recruit. He was a practical one. A man who had agreed over 2 years of careful development to share information about certain clients and certain cargo movements in exchange for compensation that made other considerations secondary. Cyprus had not been cultivated specifically for Muradpur. He had been cultivated because he sat at a node in the Istanbul cargo infrastructure that regularly brushed against Iranian-linked logistics operations. He was one of several assets in Mossad's Turkish network. He was not the most senior. He was not considered the most reliable. But in late March, Cyprus delivered something no other asset had produced in 11 months. He had a name, not a cover name. The actual name of a senior IRC logistics official, spoken carelessly during a coordination call Cyprus had been monitoring while handling paperwork for a cargo clearance the man's network had run through Cyprus's brokerage. He had a date, the 14th of April. He had a departure point, Ankara. He had a destination, Istanbul's Pendik terminal. He had a train, the 8:45 morning service. He had a carriage, second class. He had a seat, 22C. Right-hand side. Window, it was by any standard an extraordinary intelligence product. It was also, though no one at headquarters understood this yet, a product that had passed through 3 separate intermediary layers before reaching Cyprus. 3 layers, each of which had the potential to carry an error forward without correcting it. That fact was noted in the Katsa's initial report. It was flagged in the forwarding assessment. It was then placed in the category of acceptable intelligence uncertainty and left there, because the operation planning clock was already running, and there was no time to run a parallel verification track before the window closed. The unit tasked with the operation was 3 people. A senior operations officer, known in subsequent intelligence literature only by the alias Ariel, who would manage the ground team and serve as the link to headquarters throughout the operation. A technical support specialist responsible for equipment prepositioning and logistics. And the shooter. A Cadone unit veteran whose name has never been released publicly. A man who had carried out precision operations before. A man who had never attempted a shot through a moving glass pane at a target also in motion from a static ground position. Nobody had. When the shooter reviewed the initial operational parameters and the geometry of the proposed firing position 47 kilometers outside Eskişehir, he did not ask whether the shot was achievable. He had been given enough technical data to form his own preliminary judgment on that. The question he asked Ariel on the first evening of the operation planning cycle was simpler and more direct than anything in the technical briefing. He asked, "How confident are we that the man in seat 22C is actually him?" Ariel did not have a satisfying answer. What he had was a headquarters assessment rated high confidence, built on intelligence that had passed through 3 unverified layers, produced by an asset who had never before delivered targeting grade product, against a man no Western intelligence service had ever managed to photograph. High confidence, in intelligence terms, is not certainty. It is the judgment that the available evidence, weighted against the available doubts, points strongly enough in one direction to act. The shooter understood that. He had worked inside those judgments his entire career. He had acted on them before and been right. What he understood, standing in that briefing room with 14 days to the operation and no way to run an independent confirmation, was that this time the cost of being wrong was not an aborted mission. It was something significantly harder to walk back. He agreed to proceed. But he did not stop asking the question. He would keep asking it, in different forms, for every one of the 14 days that followed. Nobody at headquarters gave him a better answer. The Ankara to Istanbul high-speed rail line does not offer many choices. For most of its length, the track cuts through open plateau. Flat terrain, minimal elevation. Long exposure in both directions. A shooter positioned anywhere along the majority of that route would be visible for several minutes before and after the train passed. That is not a position. That is a liability. Mossad's technical team had spent 4 days analyzing the full route before the operation was approved. What they were looking for was not a perfect location. They understood from the beginning that a perfect location did not exist on this line. They were looking for the least imperfect one. A position that provided adequate elevation, sufficient concealment, and a geometry that gave the shooter a viable angle into the target window before the train disappeared around the next curve. They found one. 47 kilometers outside of Eskişehir, the line bends slightly southward through a low ridge section. On the eastern side of that ridge, an elevation of roughly 22 meters overlooks the track at a lateral angle that the technical team calculated at approximately 30 degrees to the right-hand windows of the second-class carriages. The exposure window at operational train speed was assessed at between 5 and 7 seconds. Consistent, repeatable, every train that passed that section at standard service speed produced the same geometry. 5 to 7 seconds sounds like enough. It is not. At 160 kilometers per hour, the target window moves across the shooter's field of view at a rate that reduces the usable engagement moment to well under 2 seconds once the angle degradation at the outer edges of the exposure corridor is removed. The shot had to be taken inside a specific fraction of that window, at a target whose exact position within the carriage would not be confirmed until the moment the carriage appeared. The shooter was given this calculation on day 3 of the planning cycle. He reviewed it overnight. He came back the following morning and asked for the atmospheric data for the ridge site across a full week, including the April 14th forecast. He was not asking because he was uncertain. He was asking because wind in that ridge section was not predictable from standard meteorological models. The terrain created channeling effects that could shift lateral wind by several meters per second between ground level and the elevation of the shooter's position in the space of minutes. The technical team's calculation had used regional average wind figures. The shooter wanted site-specific data. The site-specific data did not exist. No meteorological station operated near enough to the ridge to produce it. The technical team told him they could position a small sensor unit at the site 2 days before the operation to begin logging. That would give him approximately 48 hours of data to work from on the morning of the 14th. 48 hours of data for a shot that would be taken in a fraction of 2 seconds under conditions that could change between the last logged reading and the moment the train appeared. The shooter accepted this. He did not accept it without noting, in the operational log that Ariel maintained throughout the planning cycle, that the wind variable introduced an irreducible uncertainty that no preparation could fully eliminate. That note sat in the operational log. Headquarters was informed. The operation continued. He arrived in Turkey on the 10th of April, traveling on a European passport that placed him as a commercial photography consultant. The legend was clean. His entry through Istanbul airport was routine. He traveled to Eskişehir by bus and collected his equipment from a dead drop outside the city. A long-range precision rifle broken down and packed inside what appeared to be professional photography cases, pre-positioned by the technical specialist who had entered Turkey on a separate route 2 days earlier. On the 11th and 12th of April, the shooter was on the ridge. Not shooting. Measuring, he logged the arrival time of the regional service trains that used the same track. He ran a stopwatch against the exposure window. He noted the wind readings from the sensor unit, positioned by the technical specialist. He lay flat against the slope for hours at a time, working through the compensation calculations required for glass refraction, lateral velocity, angular drop from the shooter's elevation to the target window, and the atmospheric correction that would need to be built into the firing solution at the moment of execution. On the evening of the 12th, he transmitted a report to Ariel. The shot was achievable. Under the right conditions. If the wind held within acceptable parameters on the morning of the 14th. If the target was seated in the confirmed position. If the carriage alignment matched the technical team's mapping of the second-class section. If Ariel read the report and relayed it to headquarters with a recommendation to proceed. Headquarters confirmed. The operation was on. That confirmation arrived at 22:40 on the 12th of April. 37 minutes later, Ariel received a second message. This one was not from headquarters, it was from the Katsa in Istanbul. It was about Cyprus. Cyprus had made contact again. Not to add information, not to confirm the existing intelligence package, to issue a correction. The seat was wrong. The seat assignment for Muratpor's travel on the 14th of April was not 22C. Cyprus's contact inside the logistics chain had pushed through a correction late that evening. The final seat assignment, made the previous day when the booking was adjusted, was 22A. The other side of the carriage. The left-hand window. Not the right. Ariel read the message twice. 22C was the seat the entire operation had been built around. The ridge position 47 kilometers outside Eskişehir had been selected specifically because it provided a viable angle to the right-hand windows of the second-class carriages. The elevation, the lateral approach angle, the engagement corridor, the 5 to 7 second exposure window, the firing solution the shooter had spent 2 days constructing. All of it was oriented toward the right side of the train. 22A was on the opposite side. The left-hand window. The side that faced away from the ridge. The side that passed through the entire engagement corridor without ever becoming visible from the shooter's position at any angle that produced a viable shot. If 22A was correct, the shooter was on the wrong side of the train. Every day of preparation, every calculation, every atmospheric reading from the ridge sensor was now pointed at empty air. Ariel had 9 hours before the 8:45 departed Ankara. He did not immediately call an abort. What he did, in the first minutes after reading the correction, was run through the verification question he should have been given the resources to run on day 1. How reliable was this correction? Where had it come from? Had Cyprus spoken directly to the source, or had it passed through the same intermediary chain as the original intelligence? The answer that came back was not reassuring. Cyprus had not spoken directly to anyone. The correction had arrived through the same contact who had provided the original seat assignment. The same single node in the logistics chain that had been the source of the information from the beginning. The node that had never been independently verified. The node that Mossad had accepted because the operation clock left no room for the alternative. So the question was not simply, which seat is correct? The question was, which piece of information from an unverified source do we trust? The original, or the correction? Both had come from the same place. Both could be wrong. And there was no way to know which was right before the train left Ankara. Ariel contacted the shooter at 0100. The conversation that followed was brief and did not produce agreement. The shooter's position was straightforward. If the seat correction was accurate, the operation as currently configured was non-executable. He was not positioned to engage a left side window. He could not relocate to the opposite side of the track before dawn, pre-survey a new position, and build a firing solution from zero in the time remaining. It was not a question of willingness, it was a question of physics and time. Ariel raised a third possibility. There was a bridge. 300 meters further along the line, an old agricultural overpass crossed the track at roughly perpendicular alignment. From the top of that overpass, A shooter positioned at the correct angle would have a downward line of sight into the overhead section of the passing carriages. The angle was steep. The exposure window was shorter than the ridge, closer to 3 seconds than 6. The geometry of the shot was entirely different from anything in the existing firing solution, but from the overpass, both sides of the carriage were visible. The shooter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Send me the overpass coordinates. I will go and look at it." He was not agreeing to the shot. He was agreeing to assess whether a shot was possible from a position he had never seen, in darkness, with equipment configured for a completely different firing geometry, against a target whose location within the carriage was still unconfirmed, in less than 8 hours. Ariel sent the coordinates. Then he sent a second message to headquarters requesting guidance on abort authorization. Headquarters did not immediately respond. At 0140, the shooter was already moving toward the bridge. At 0215, headquarters came back with its answer. They were not authorizing an abort. They were asking Ariel to assess the overpass option and report back within 90 minutes. The operation had not been canceled. It had been handed back to the men on the ground, in the dark, without enough information to be certain of anything. With 7 hours left before the train left Ankara and nothing but an agricultural bridge and an unverified seat correction standing between them and a decision nobody at headquarters wanted to make. The overpass was not what Ariel had described. The coordinates placed it correctly. The structure existed. But when the shooter reached it at 0240 and climbed to the top with a headlamp stripped to its lowest setting, what he found was not a clean elevated position. It was a concrete agricultural bridge that had not been maintained in years. The outer edges were cracked. The parapet on the eastern side, the side that would face the oncoming train, was partially collapsed along a 2-meter section directly above the track's centerline. The surface was uneven. There was no flat section long enough to establish a stable prone position without bracing one leg against the low remaining parapet wall. He spent 11 minutes on the bridge without touching his equipment. He was not measuring angles. He was deciding whether the structure would hold his weight without producing movement at the moment of firing. Any vibration transmitted through the concrete at the point of trigger pull would push the shot outside an already narrow margin. He climbed down. He walked the base of the bridge on both sides. He found what he was looking for on the western approach, a concrete support ledge running along the underside of the structure at approximately 4 meters above ground level. Narrow, roughly 50 centimeters wide. Accessible by climbing the embankment and stepping across a meter-wide gap, but solid. Original construction material, not subject to the deterioration that had compromised the top surface. The problem with the support ledge was the angle. From 4 meters below the track level rather than above it, the downward shot geometry was gone. The line of sight into the passing carriages was lateral and low, not overhead. But the ledge was on the western side of the bridge, which meant the train would be moving toward the shooter rather than across him. The target window, if the seat correction was accurate and Muradpur was on the left side of the carriage, would briefly face directly toward the ledge position as the train came through the bridge section before the carriages rotated past. Briefly, the exposure window he calculated, standing on that ledge in darkness with a penlight and a stopwatch, was approximately 1.2 seconds. He had been working with a 5 to 7 second window on the ridge. Now he was looking at 1.2. He transmitted his assessment to Ariel at 0350. He described the ledge position. He described the angle. He described the exposure window. He stated clearly that if the seat correction was accurate, this was the only viable position available given the time and equipment constraints. He also stated, with equal clarity, that if the original seat assignment was correct and Muradpur was on the right side of the carriage, the left side window would be on the far side of the train as it passed through the bridge. The shot would not exist at all. He was asking Ariel to choose which piece of intelligence to trust. The original. Or the correction. Ariel sat with that for 19 minutes. The operational log recorded his response at 0412. He told the shooter to take the ledge position. He told him to build the firing solution for 22A, the left side, the corrected seat. He told him that if the carriage passed and the target window was on the wrong side, they would stand down and the operation would be reassessed. He did not tell the shooter what reassessed meant, because he did not know, and because by 0412 there was no longer enough time for reassessment to produce anything. The shooter was on the ledge before 0500. He spent the next 2 hours running the new firing solution. The geometry was entirely different from the ridge calculation. The lateral movement component was reduced because the train was approaching rather than crossing his field of view. But the closing speed introduced its own compensation requirements. He ran the numbers. He ran them again. He arrived at a solution he assessed as workable under the condition that his stabilization on the ledge remained solid and the target was visible in the window at the moment of the train's approach. At 0630, a regional freight service came through the bridge section. The shooter tracked it through his optic. He confirmed the ledge held. He confirmed his position was not visible from the train at any point during the approach or passage. He confirmed the bridge structure produced no vibration on the ledge at freight train speed. That was the closest thing to a clean moment the operation had produced in 3 days. Then, the wind shifted. At 0715, the sensor unit on the ridge logged a significant change in the local wind pattern. The channeling effect the shooter had identified during his 2 days of preparation had reversed direction. The atmospheric data he had spent 48 hours building was no longer representative of the conditions he would be firing in. The correction was not minor. It was the difference between the shot landing where his calculation said it would land and the shot landing somewhere measurably different. He rebuilt the atmospheric compensation from the current sensor reading and the physical indicators he could observe from the ledge. The behavior of dry grass on the embankment below, the movement of a loose piece of material caught against the base of the bridge. They were not precise instruments. They were the instruments he had. He had a new firing solution at 0750. He assessed it as viable. He did not assess it as the solution he would have built with more time and better data. He held his position. He waited. At 0830, his earpiece registered Ariel's check-in. The 845 had departed Ankara on schedule. No anomalies reported at the station. The target boarding had not been confirmed because they had no asset positioned to confirm it. They were operating on the assumption that the man who had booked a seat under the name Karim Turani had boarded the train he was supposed to board. They were about to find out if that assumption held. At 0920, Ariel transmitted a single word, approaching. The shooter settled into his position on the ledge. His breathing was already controlled. The firing solution was set. His eye was at the optic. At 0924, he acquired the front of the train in his field of view coming through the slight curve before the bridge approach. He began tracking the second-class section. He was looking for the third window from the front of the carriage, left side. A seated male figure, slightly reclined, consistent with the physical profile built from the partial intelligence developed over 11 months. He found the right section of the carriage. He did not find a seated male figure. The seat appeared empty. For 2.5 seconds, the shooter was tracking a window with no visible occupant. The train was closing at full speed. The engagement window was collapsing. He held. He did not fire. He was not going to fire into an empty seat. At 1.1 seconds before the position passed outside his viable angle, a figure shifted in that seat. Not a new arrival. Someone who had been reclined low enough that their head had not been visible over the seat back until they moved. The shooter had 0.8 seconds. He took the shot. The sound of the shot was absorbed into the ambient noise of the passing train before the carriage had fully cleared the bridge section. The train did not slow. There were no brakes. The carriages continued through and out the other side and were gone within seconds, the tail of the train disappearing around the next curve at full operational speed. The shooter held his position for 40 seconds after the last carriage cleared. He did not move immediately. He was listening for anything that indicated the shot had been registered. A change in train speed visible from the bridge. Radio traffic. vehicle movement on the road that paralleled the track 200 meters to the south. There was nothing. The train was gone. The track was empty. The bridge was quiet. He could not confirm a hit. At that speed, at that distance, through that glass, with a target that had been partially obscured until less than a second before the shot, he could not confirm anything. He did not know whether the round had found the figure in that seat or whether it had struck the seat back, the window frame, the far wall, or nothing at all. He transmitted 2 words to Ariel: "Shot fired." Then he began breaking down his equipment, not because he was certain the operation had succeeded, but because regardless of what had just happened inside that carriage, staying on that ledge was no longer a viable option. The only people who would know whether the shot had worked were the ones who found the body. Or did not find one. The train arrived at Pendik Terminal at 12:41. Ariel was not at the terminal. He was in a rented room in Istanbul's Beyoğlu district, watching a phone that had not yet produced anything useful. The shooter was on a bus back toward the city, equipment broken down and distributed across 3 separate carry bags, moving through the kind of ordinary afternoon traffic that exists entirely indifferent to what may or may not have just happened on a bridge outside Eskişehir. Neither of them knew whether Muratpur was dead. For 3 hours after the train arrived, the operation existed in a state that intelligence services do not train people to discuss comfortably. Not success. Not failure, a suspended condition in which every extraction decision and every communications protocol continued to execute while the central question remained entirely unanswered. Then a Turkish newswire carried a brief item. A passenger on the morning service from Ankara had been found unresponsive at Pendik Terminal. Male, traveling alone. Turkish police called to the scene. No name. No nationality, just the word unresponsive. Ariel forwarded it to headquarters without commentary and waited. What Ariel did not know, sitting in that room in Beyoğlu, was that the consequences of the operation had already started moving before the Turkish newswire published a single word. Inside the IRGC's counterintelligence structure, a quiet alarm had already been triggered, not because anyone at that point knew what had happened on the train, but because Muratpur had not made contact at the scheduled check-in window that was built into every logistics coordination trip he made. He was never late. The check-in window was narrow, and the protocol for missing it was automatic. A missing check-in from a logistics coordinator at his level produced a specific sequence of actions within the IRC security architecture, none of which required a body to be found or a cause of death to be confirmed. Those actions began on the afternoon of the 14th. By the time Turkish authorities had established that the man found at Pendik was not ill, but dead, and had begun the investigation that would take 11 days to attribute his death to an externally fired projectile, the IRC had already begun a parallel process that had nothing to do with the Turkish investigation. They were auditing the logistics chain. Not because they knew a sniper had been involved, because a senior coordinator had missed a check-in and had not made contact through any of the secondary protocols, and in the world Muratpur inhabited, that had only one credible explanation. The audit began with the Turkish transit corridor. The specific nodes Muratpur had managed, every touchpoint in the supply chain he had personally supervised became, within 24 hours of the missed check-in, a suspected point of compromise. That audit produced its first result before Mossad received confirmation that the man found at Pendik was Muratpur at all. One Turkish intermediary in the logistics chain was quietly removed from access to IRGC-linked cargo operations. Not Cyprus. A different node. A contact who had done nothing wrong, and who was now disconnected from a network he had served reliably for years, because a dead man's absence had triggered an audit that swept up everyone in proximity. The first collateral damage of the operation was not to the target. It was to an uninvolved party in the wrong position at the wrong moment, and it happened before the operation was officially confirmed as a success. Mossad received confirmation that the passenger found at Pendik was Hasan Muratpur on the evening of the 16th of April, 2 days after the shot. The confirmation came through Turkish investigative channels accessed by Israeli intelligence assets embedded in the relevant security apparatus. At headquarters, the operation was recorded as a success. A senior Quds Force logistics coordinator had been removed. The supply chain infrastructure he managed had been disrupted. The operation had been executed without a single Israeli operative being identified, detained, or publicly connected to the event. By every internal metric, it was a clean outcome. What the metric did not capture was already visible to the analyst who had spent 9 months building the profile that had made the operation possible. In the 6 weeks following Muratpour's death, the IRGC did not slow the movement of precision-guided munitions into Lebanon. It accelerated it. The disruption to the logistics chain was real and measurable. The response to that disruption was to push more material through faster, through routes and intermediaries that had not been flagged by the audit, using a redundancy that Muratpour's network had apparently been designed to enable even in the event of his own removal. He had not been the only coordinator. He had been the visible one, the one whose operational signature had accumulated enough pattern over 19 years to be tracked, however imperfectly, by a 9-month intelligence effort and an asset who happened to be in the right position to hear a careless conversation. The ones who replaced him had no such accumulated signature. They were starting clean. The analyst noted this in her post-operation assessment. She noted that the intelligence architecture that had produced Cyprus and the chain that had eventually yielded a name and a train and a seat number had been burned in its most useful configuration by the very operation it enabled. The nodes were gone. The access was gone. The audit had swept through the network with enough precision to identify the general shape of where the penetration had occurred, even if the specific source was not identified. Building a comparable level of access to the reconstituted logistics chain would take years, possibly longer than it had taken to build the access that produced this operation. The operation had removed a man. It had also removed the intelligence infrastructure that found him. Ariel was debriefed over 3 days when he returned. He answered every question put to him accurately and without omission. He described the seat correction. He described the 19 minutes he spent trying to decide which piece of intelligence from the same unverified source to trust. He described telling the shooter to take the ledge position and build a firing solution for a side of the train he had never prepared for, in the dark, with less than 8 hours to execution. He described transmitting the 2-word confirmation that the shot had been fired without knowing whether it had worked. He was asked whether, in his assessment, the operation should have been aborted when the seat correction arrived. He said he did not know. Headquarters had not authorized an abort. The window for reassessment had already closed. He had made a choice under conditions that did not allow certainty, and the choice had produced a result the metrics called a success, and he was not fully comfortable with that framing. He was not disciplined. He was not commended. He was rotated out of active field operations for 18 months. The operation that cost Muratpour his life cost Ariel the 2 years of field momentum he had built toward the position he had expected to hold next. It cost the shooter something that has never been documented in any account. And it cost the intelligence architecture that found Muratpour the access that had made finding him possible. Precision targeting of this kind did not emerge from a single asset or a single operation. It was built over decades, case by case, source by source, through a methodology for penetrating denial and deception architectures that most intelligence services have never fully understood from the outside. The cases that built that methodology are not in any public file. Some of them are in the ebook in the description. What we put together covers the operational history behind how Mossad developed and used targeting pipelines like the one that found Muratpour, the intelligence chain construction, the asset management under time pressure, and the institutional decisions that determined when an operation proceeded and when it did not. The link is in the description below. There is a version of this story that ends with the confirmation of a successful shot, and a senior IRGC official removed from a supply chain he had managed for nearly 2 decades. That version is accurate. It is also incomplete. The operation succeeded, and in succeeding, it dismantled the intelligence access that made it possible, accelerated the supply pipeline it was designed to slow, and left the men who carried it out with the result the institutional record called clean, and that none of them have ever described as such. That is not an exception to how these operations work. It is the standard condition. If you are watching Hidden Ops because you want to understand how intelligence services operate behind the outcomes the public record eventually confirms, subscribe. We do not cover the clean version. We cover the part before the confirmation and the part that stays unresolved after it.